Haircut jump scare. Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Fix Computers. I've got a HP here that has no power. This has been into another shop before who had a look at it, determined there was a motherboard fault and bailed. So don't know what I'm walking into here. Might be that they couldn't do board repair, might be that they've already taken a swing at the board and found that it was a rabbit hole. Who knows, let's find out. So I shall plug in a charger and I'll try and do it on camera. Right, nothing at all. No light on the charger. Looks like it's stone dead. Let's get the back cover off super quick. Wi-Fi card isn't in properly, but if you're reassembling a dead laptop, you're not going to be that fussed. Battery was reconnected. Fair. Right, not seeing any signs that it's been messed with that much from the outset. So let's get the battery disconnected and then we can start doing some stabbing. Right, let's put the multimeter into resistance mode and we're just going to check for a short across the DC jack. Nope, that's 200,000 ohms, which is about right. The DC jack resistance can vary wildly. Like I've seen them as low as 18k ohms and as high as 200k ohms. But basically, what we would be looking for is 0 kind of thing. Basically, if it's into the kilo ohms range, then it's not what we're looking for. Fine. Where is... Okay, so CPU V-core is here. You can see we've got some big inductors and some power stages that go into the CPU. So let's just stab a couple of these capacitors and see if anything looks out of the ordinary. I'll just stick my black probe on a screw hole for this. So left side is negative, so that'll be ground. Yep. 0.1. Right side is positive. And we've got 0.23. So we do have a short on the motherboard. So I believe this is an input capacitor because it's kind of like on the input side of it. Like what we're looking for here is stuff around the top is input, then you've got the power stages, then we've got the inductors, and then there'll be more capacitors like this one here. That capacitor there is on the output side of the VRMs, so that is probably sitting on CPU V-core. So if we measure that one, negative side is on the right here because the stripe is on the left. So that is ground again. And on this side, we should see CPU resistance. Yeah, 140 ohms. So 140 ohms, fairly arbitrary value. Modern CPUs are weird. That could be one of the secondary rails into it. However, it's not the same resistance that we're seeing on this capacitor. So certainly for at least one of the CPU rails that capacitor is on, we are not seeing a short at the CPU. But we are seeing a short on the input side of it. So it looks like we have a main rail short. I'm going to roll the intro and we're going to take the motherboard out and take a closer look at things. I'll see you guys after the cut. Let's back up a bit and ask the question, how did I know where to do those initial stab tests? Because for regular viewers of the channel, they'll see me stab in the place, they'll see me check rails, but how do we know where the rails are? How do we know where to look? So let's come under the microscope and run through that first section again and I'll point out how I determined that this had a short on the board, and then we can go through step by step how we're going to respond to that. So I'm going to come under the microscope so we can get a closer look at where I'm poking. I'll start out up here next to the Wi-Fi card, because here's where the DC jack comes in. So the DC jack is going to be up in the top corner of the laptop, and it connects in with a little fly cable that connects to this connector here. So DC in, DC in. And so firstly, what I did was we're going to put my black probe on the negative side and my red probe on the positive side, because the wires coming on the right-hand side were red, so those are going to be the positives. So we go to check those, and this is where we saw that, 175, 200 kilo ohms, that kind of value. So the DC jack is fine, and that's kind of what I'd expect, to be honest. In some of my earlier board repair videos, I had quite a couple of hits where we would find a shorted DC jack, and that would be caused by a bad TVS diode across the jack. And does this even have a TVS diode? Just gonna have a quick look. I don't think it does. We check on the back of it. No, I think a lot of modern laptops just stopped bothering to put a TVS diode across the jack, and that would be there to protect it against reverse voltage if the wrong charger was plugged in, or if there was just a massive over voltage, like a massive static shock, or just a catastrophic charger failure that tried to put mains voltage into the DC jack. The TVS diode would just clamp that across there, and it would explode this, but it would save the rest of the laptop, But it looks like they tend not to bother with those on modern laptops. Failing that, I just don't see them fail that often anymore. But it's still worth checking the DC jack, because if you do see a short there, that means you've probably got a fault somewhere close. And with no TVS diode, the next thing in line, if we move further down, would be the DC in MOSFET. So here's one of them. Do we have a pair? Normally there's two. No, we don't have another one on the back. So we've got just a single MOSFET here, but that's going to depend on the power architecture of the laptop, which I'm not going to drill into now because we're getting we're going to start going down a rabbit hole. But if we had a short on the DC jack, we would expect to see a problem with the DC in MOSFET or DC in MOSFETs that are the next in line. So after I checked the DC jack, the next thing I did was I said, okay, well, let's check the main power rail. So how do we know where that is? Well, the most reliable way to find it is to go somewhere where it's going to be used. In previous things, I would say, well, we go through the DC MOSFET and we become the main power rail. Well, let's check that, shall we? I'll put my black probe on on a screw hole, and let's check so the power's coming up and over into this guy and then out from this guy. Is the output shorted? And no, it's not. We're getting megohms there. And the reason for that is that this is not the main power rail from this DC in MOSFET yet, because this laptop uses a narrow voltage DC architecture. And that means that this, after we go through the DC in MOSFET, there's another stage of power conversion somewhere else in the laptop, which then brings that DC voltage down to something much closer to the battery voltage. Narrow voltage DC means that the motherboard is operating in a narrow power band. The alternative would be that the motherboard is expecting to operate anywhere from battery voltage all the way up to 20 volts from the charger. So if you've got a 3-cell battery knocking out 11.1 nominal, that's a 10 volt range that your main power rail could be sitting at, which is huge. So narrow voltage motherboards have a narrow range where the 20 volts coming in from the charger gets stepped down again, and it steps it down to something that is much closer to the battery voltage, like, say, 12 or 13 volts or something like that. So that's why we're not going to look at DC in MOSFETs very much. We've had a quick look. There's no visible shorts here at first blush, so we're going to move on. So to find the main power rail, I then went straight up to CPU vCore. So here's the CPU with all the thermal paste on it, and right above it, we've got a row of power inductors and a row of power stages, so these chips here. Now, the CPU is going to be powered from the main rail, so by going straight to CPU vCore, we've skipped past all of that narrow voltage DC stuff, we've skipped past all of the power conversion, and gone straight for where the power is being used. So let's have a look at these. We've got a couple of these here. This one looks slightly different, and that's because the CPU itself will have multiple rails going into it. We've got vCore, which is the big beefy power rail that actually does all the compute, but then there are also lots of auxiliary rails for graphics, the I/O controller, memory controller, things like that. And that's why there are a couple of different ones here, and there'll be a bunch of other stuff. There's probably more power around down here and all of that kind of stuff. So the next thing I did was I checked these big capacitors, this one here, or we could also use this one here, because these are going to be sitting on the main power rail. And if you have a look, you can see here how this has a trace feeding around into here. And also, if we have a look on this power stage as well, we've got a large trace taking up 3 pins of this state power stage, and then there's another 3 pins down below, and we've got some capacitors across that. So one of these is going to be the main power rail, the main input, and the other one is going to be a ground pad. And then at the bottom here, we've got all of these pins are all going directly down into this inductor. So that's going to be our output. So again, without using any schematics, just at first blush, we can just look at the chip and start estimating what the layout of this board looks like. So if we assume that this is going to be the input, we can measure these big input capacitors like I did, or we can measure around here at the input. So let's do that. My black probe is on a ground pin again, just on a screw hole. And if we check the top side of these, we've got 0.3 ohms there, 0.4. I'm just going to press a bit harder here. Let's try that again. It's not super confident. It's about half an ohm. Okay, fine. If we check the other side of it, 0.23, 0.3, you know, it's lower. So again, this is going to be our ground side. Let's go back up to the big capacitor. Positive side. See, on here we get a solid 0.3 ohms. So we've got a much more confident reading there. Might be that we're closer to the short. However, either way, we definitely have a short on the power input to these power stages. So that's how we know that we have a main rail short. So the next thing that we want to do then is, again, we want to check if the main rail short is appearing on the outputs here. So if we check the outputs, so we'll just check one of these inductors here. I'll just pick this one here. We see 50 ohms, well, 48 ohms. And that is the resistance going into the CPU. And we're expecting to see low resistance into the CPU. But the important thing is that 48 ohms there, that is not the short circuit we're seeing. It's not that sort of 0.3, 0.5 ohm short. So from here, we can be reasonably confident that none of these power stages have failed and caused a short directly into the CPU. That kills the CPU. So this is good news for us. It means we probably have something fixable. What we probably have is a dead capacitor somewhere nearby. So now we're playing that game of, okay, well, can we see any dead capacitors? Now, every now and then you'll get lucky and they'll be visible, but most of the time they won't be. But, you know, we can just have a quick scan around, see if we can see anything just blatantly obvious. So it doesn't look like there's much going on around vCore. What about the other side? And on the back of the board, we've got, you know, more capacitors here. This is on the back of those power stages, so any of these guys could be a suspect. And, you know, it can be monstrously hard to spot a dead capacitor, especially, you know, on camera. when you're not moving the board around. Lots of people might look to something like, say, you know, this guy here. Is that a crack? Nope, that's just a hair. That's just a bit of fluff. It's really hard to tell from a range. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to come out from under the microscope. The only thing that I can really do at this point is just stare at the board and just see if I can spot anything. So I'm going to do that for a moment. We've got some USB capacitors around here. Had luck with those in the past. But, you know, those look okay. Another one over here for the SSD. Seems fine. But I'm not seeing anything that's jumping out at me on this one. Nothing visible here. And that's pretty standard. I've had a couple of really good luck videos recently where there's been very clear visible damage and I've gone, there it is, and just immediately pointed to the fault on the board. That's uncommon. You don't get lucky like that very often. And case in point, there's nothing visibly wrong on this board. So this is the part where we start thinking about voltage injection. And so that means we're going to go down our checklist of, should we inject power onto this board? Well, why do we think we should inject power? We have a short circuit on the main power rail, and we don't know what component is shorted on the board. Power injection will help us find it. Next thing, have we identified the short circuit that we're expecting the power injection to reveal? Yes, we have. We have identified the short on the rail. Same answer. We know that it's on the main rail. We know that that rail is at, less than 1 ohm, and it should not be. It should be high resistance. So we're going to inject onto the main rail, and we know that it's going to reveal a faulty component somewhere. Okay. So next thing on the checklist. If we inject on the main power rail, is that going to damage something else? Well, what could it damage? It could damage the CPU, or it could damage the PCH. These are silicon stuff. Is there anything else? We don't have a GPU on this one, and the memory is not there. So the CPU and the PCH are what we're worried about. So could we damage either of those? Well, the CPU, we've already established that there's no short into V-core because we checked the inductor there. So that's fine. What about the PCH though? We don't know what's going on there. How would we know if we're going to damage that? Well, the PCH isn't directly powered from the main power rail. It's powered from the sub-rails, so the 3 volt and 5 volt rails. And we haven't actually looked at those at all. So we should probably check those first. So how do we find the 3.3 and 5 volt rails? Well, those are going to be secondary rails, so we're looking for additional power rails on the laptop. And the giveaway for a power rail is that it's going to have inductors on it. So these inductors are power converters. There's another one here under this bit here. That's not coming off, but there's another inductor there. And obviously, like we had inductors on the V-core power rails there. So let's just stab each of these and just check if any of those seem out of whack. One of them is going to be the 3.3. One of them is going to be the 5 volt. There'll also be a 1 volt rail there as well. And one of them is going to be the battery charger. Don't know what number 5 is. But what we can do is we can just stab them and just see if we get any weird readings from any of them, a la the same short circuit that we found elsewhere. So we're looking for 0 ohms resistance, basically. I'll put the black probe on ground again, and let's just poke each of these in turn. So this guy, we've got 10K, all right. This guy, 10K, all right. This one, 5K. This one, 165 ohms. So that one's fairly low, but it's not 0. And then this guy over here is at 1K. So none of those guys are screamingly shorted to ground. If we found 0 ohms on any of those, then we'd want to discover which one that is and then ask ourselves, okay, well, why is that at 0 ohms? Because if we found, for example, that the 3.3 volt regulator was at 0 ohms, that might mean that the 3.3 volt regulator has failed and we have a short circuit from the main power rail through the 3.3 volt regulator and into the PCH. And if we try to inject on the main power rail, our power that we're injecting is going to go from the main power rail into the 3.3 volt rail and into the PCH, which doesn't help us. So by checking all of these, we've established that we probably don't have a bad PCH here. That's probably okay. This is almost certainly a bad capacitor. So at this point, I feel pretty confident in saying that if we inject power onto the main power rail, one of the capacitors on the board is going to light up, and that's going to reveal our fault. So let's do that. So how am I going to inject onto the main power rail? Well, we could spend a bunch of time looking at all the power circuits down here and figuring out how that narrow voltage DC input works, because that's probably being done down here where all the battery connects and all this power stuff is. But we also know that these capacitors are shorted, and those are big tantalum capacitors, and it would be very easy to just stab those. Next, we need to decide how much power we're going to inject, and so the general rule of thumb, we're going to be using a thermal camera, so we don't need a loss of current here. So we're going to start at 1 volt, 2 amps, and see how far we get. Because we want to be as gentle as possible. Less is more. A lot of people will say, oh, why don't you just inject this many amps? Because then it'll be really obvious. Well, the problem there is that if you inject a huge amount of power and whatever it is that is shorted goes nuclear, it will just weld itself to the board. And that increases the likelihood of damaging the board when you try and remove it. And this is, if that happens, there's probably visible damage somewhere already. However, we follow best practices. So let's dial in 1 volt. 1 volt, 2 amps. And I'm going to put my ground crocodile clip onto this handy screw hole here. And hopefully we should get a good enough connection with that. One of the problems with using crocodile clips and such and stabbing is that you don't get a very good connection. In previous videos, I've often soldered jumper leads onto the board, and I do that because then you get a really good connection to the board, so you're not dropping power just in your connections. However, with thermal cameras, you get a lot of leeway, so we can usually get away with this. And the thermal camera I'm going to be using is my Infrared P2 Pro. And I'm starting out without the macro lens on, just so we can just do a broad view of the board. So there's my hand underneath it. And then when we think we're onto something, I can use my macro lens here to go really close up and identify which individual component it is. So I'm going to turn on the power, and then I'm going to stab this capacitor here. So let's turn on the power. And what we're going to see as I stab is the power supply drops. So what we're seeing as I stab is that the power supply it hasn't dropped volts. Normally you would expect the voltage to drop as we go into a short. However, we're staying at 1 volt and we're pulling 1.2 amps. That's not good. That means we've got resistance somewhere. So we don't have a good connection into the board because we're expecting a short circuit. I'm not seeing anything light up on the top of the board. Oh, yes, I am. There it is. Look in the bottom right. Bottom right of the screen. There's a little dot. And it'll disappear. There we go. Something lit up down here. So we had a bad connection there, but it was enough. Let's take a closer look. I'm going to reposition stuff. Now I know I'm looking in the bottom right of the board. Right, let's go again. Alright, so there it is. What am I looking at? It's a bit above and a bit to the right of one of those inductors. So I think it's that guy. Let's come in for the glorious close-up with the macro lens. I think I've seen enough already, but I'll do the close-up anyway because fun. Not quite the thing I thought it was, but we'll see it. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's a good shot. Okay. And there's our culprit, folks. So that guy dead center, you can see a little dot with a wisp above it where the magic smoke has escaped. Can we see anything from the side? Not really. Apart from that little hole in the wisp, it looks okay. Now you play the game of, was the hole always there or did it appear when I injected power into it? We're going to take that guy off the board and we'll see if our short circuit disappears. Let's turn on the soldering iron. So I'm going to wet these joins here with some leaded solder just to soften them up. Alright, and the other side. There we go. Don't worry, that MOSFET below will be okay. And now I'm going to two-hand this. I'm going to bring in my main soldering iron, and we're just going to dual wield this off the board. And this means that I don't have to use hot air near the... we've got the DIMM connector right here, that's plastic, and we've got the battery connector right there, that's plastic. So I don't really want to use hot air here if I can. So we're just going to dual wield soldering irons. Come on. Come on. There we go. Whoops, just tidy you up because I just glanced to you. There we go. Now I'll come with the multimeter, and if we just check the resistance across this, we should find that it's 0. And there we go. That is a shorted capacitor. And now just for confirmation, I'll just get you out of here. Let's go up to the top. So here's the original site where we were looking at. Here's CPU vCore. And we should now find that if I put my black probe on a screw hole and check that capacitor again, we're now no longer shorted there. Got 10 kilo ohms. And I can also check down here where I was also looking and see that we've got meg ohms. So yeah, no problem there at all. Our short is gone. So now the question is, what value is this capacitor that we've taken off the board? Because I kind of want to put it back again. Well, this one's difficult because that's a chunky boy there. My guess is that it's a 20 microfarad because it's quite a big boy. The smaller one next to it is probably a 10. If it had been the small one to the right there, I'd have instantly just guessed 10 microfarad and slapped a 10 on the board. However, because that's a slightly chunkier boy, I'm not 100% sure. So let's see if we can find a replacement. This board is a DAX 8QIMB 8B1, of course, absolute classic, Rev B. So I'm going to Google that. I'm going to Google DAX 8QIMB 8B1 schematic and see if anything comes up. And the answer to that was no, I could not find a schematic. However, looking around the board, we've got this capacitor here is the same size, and if we look over to the right, that's where we took it off, and there's also some big guys here as well. It is extremely likely that these are the same value capacitors, because the way that these things work, they want to use the same components where possible, so it is extremely likely that these are the same rating. So I'm going to take one of those off the board and use that as my guess. Ultimately, it's not going to make a huge difference as long as we put some capacitance back there. So we're aiming to be in the same order of magnitude, basically. Like as I say, my guess is that this is a 20 mic capacitor, and if we put in, say, a 10 microfarad capacitor, that'd probably be good enough as well, just to make sure there's some capacitance there. But if we can measure this one and see a confirmation of that, then that would be ideal. So let's do that. Right. Multimeter in capacitance mode. Let's have a quick look. Try not to send this thing into the 90th dimension. Alright. Whoops. Oh, I've just fallen off. There it is. 24 microfarads. So, given a 20% margin of error, that is probably 22, 20, 24, that kind of area. Oh, and I've just flicked it. That might be gone. Oh, there we go, I found it. So what I will do is I'll have a look in my spare capacitors, and I've more than likely got like a 22, I think is the closest common value to that. So we'll replace these capacitors with 22 microfarad capacitors. I think those are 0806 in size, so we'll have a look for those. I'll flatten these pads down so we can get a nice clean start. You always want to flatten the pads if you're going to come in with the soldering iron. It just makes things so much easier. Come on. Okay, flux. There's the flux. There it is. That's good enough. There's a little bit on the top pad, but that's fine because we're going to add some solder to one pad anyway. You can tell that's the ground side. Right, now I don't have any 0805 caps, so I'm coming in with a 0603 here. But that is a 22 microfarad, so that'll do us just fine. This is a time where we need to be careful with the voltage rating on the replacement capacitor. These 0603 22 mic caps are only rated for 16 volts, which is kinda low for this rail. Most of the time the voltage rating on a ceramic cap will be at least 20 or 25 volts, meaning we don't have to worry about it. It's only because we're on a narrow voltage DC board that I get away with this. I should have doubled up to two 10 microfarad capacitors with a higher voltage rating, or ordered bigger caps and waited. I don't advise doing what I'm doing here, but this video was recorded a few weeks ago and the device has held up just fine. Come on, onto the pad. Soldering iron isn't flat at the moment, so the solder is just... I'm turning it around. The solder is just going onto the iron instead of the board. There we go. That should do. Let's come in there with some cleanup now. There we go. That's not super pretty, but it'll do, and it means that I don't have to come in with hot air around this area. I just nicked the bottom of the dim slot there, but that'll be okay. Alright. Let's make sure that we're not shorted again, just for whatever reason. And we're not. We've got a nice healthy 10 kiloohms there, which isn't super high, but I'm guessing that's fine. It's not a short circuit. If I come back onto that again, now reads megohms. Readings like that tend to happen when you're dealing with a power rail that's got a lot of capacitance on it, like this main power rail does. When you initially probe it with the multimeter is feeding power into the capacitors and charging them up, and it will read this as a lower resistance, which is why the resistance can start low and start building up. That's the capacitors charging. And so initially, your multimeter will give you a reading to the best of its ability. But then if you stab it a second time immediately after that, it may read drastically higher because you're then seeing the capacitors in their high resistance charged state. So that's kind of just what happens. But in this instance, what we're checking for is to make sure that we're not at 0 ohms. So the exact number doesn't really matter as long as it's not 0. laptop turned on as soon as I plugged in the battery there, so just watch out for that when you're doing reassembly. It just beeps loudly as well. Well, that sounds promising. I would imagine the battery would be flat. No, it's on. The laptop is powered up. Okay. Real-time clock power loss. That's because I disconnected it. That's fine. Enter. Reboot the system. And so, we know the laptop works already. And let's just plug in a charger and make sure we get a charge light. No charge light. However, I haven't replugged the charger since I plugged it in previously. So it's possible that the charger is in an off state right now. I'll just unplug that. Plug it back in again. And let's try the laptop one more time. There we go. And there's our charge light. Excellent. Right, this is saying no boot device found because I haven't put the SSD back in. The SSD was originally supplied taped to the back of the laptop, where the previous shop had assumed that the laptop was going to be a write-off and taken that out for data recovery, which is a reasonable move to make. I do the same thing. So, however, I will now put that back in the laptop. However, I think you guys have seen enough. You guys don't need to watch me put an SSD in. It goes there. So thank you everyone for tuning in. The other shop that looked at this one are not a million miles away from me. No idea if they recommended that the customer bring it to me or not. If they did, thanks for the referral. And if you're watching this video, I hope this was informative in showing you guys how to approach the problem that you guys couldn't solve. And I mean that in a genuine way. Because this is a real classic case of how to get started with board repair, dead capacitor on the board, power injection, stuff like that. Even if you can't do it yet, hopefully just looking at this gives you an idea on how to approach it, how to recognize it when you see it. And those are recognizing potential faults that you can fix is the first step toward actually being able to fix those faults. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.